Today, I'd like to talk about one of the greatest television miniseries of all time, the BBC's I Claudius from 1976. I Claudius was based on two books by Robert Graves, I Claudius, which was written in 1934, and Claudius the God, written in 1935. I have read both of these books, but I read I Claudius a very long time ago. Way back in high school, I only kind of vaguely remember it. Claudius the God I read a little bit more recently, a few years ago, and in fact I reviewed it on this channel. I will leave a link in the description down below to my review of Claudius the God. So I remember one of the books very vaguely, and one of the books a little bit better. In that respect, I suppose I'm not the ideal person to review the miniseries. The ideal reviewer would have read the books much more recently and would be able to compare and contrast the miniseries with the book in much more detail. I'm only going to be able to do it in general terms, but I'm sure somebody out there on YouTube has a better review than me. That being said, I would like to talk about it just because this miniseries is near and dear to my heart. So I read the I Claudius book when I was in high school, and this was in the early 90s, and at that time it was a lot harder to track down stuff. I remember hearing about the miniseries, and hearing that it was very well regarded, but I just had no way of tracking it down, even though I was very curious to see it. I didn't actually track it down until some years later when I was living in Cambodia. And if you've been to Cambodia, you know you can find cheap DVDs of many different series. And so I got the DVD package of I Claudius and I watched it then. Let me give some brief comments before I get into the details. I Claudius came out in 1976, so some time ago, but my impression watching it was that despite being very old, it is completely engrossing. Somewhat surprisingly engrossing, because you almost expect something from the 1970s to be a little bit boring, move at a slower pace, be not quite so interesting. You know, it was a different time, people had different attention spans, etc. But you get sucked into this immediately, and you are just hooked from the beginning of it to the end of it. And that's not just my opinion, that seems to be the common opinion. Look at anybody's review of I Claudius. It seems to be that almost everyone agrees it's a very compelling miniseries, despite the fact that it's so old. Now, that's not to say it's not dated. Certainly the effects and the staging of it are dated. There's some over-the-top acting, which probably would have been not gotten filmed nowadays, would have been given different direction nowadays. The musical sting is a little bit over the top, overly dramatic music in a way that they wouldn't do nowadays, etc. But despite seeing that the style of the film is different than the modern style, the actual story itself completely sucks you in. It's been called by many different people a soap opera set in ancient Rome. And it completely is a soap opera set in ancient Rome. I've been told by some people that The Sopranos has taken influence from I Claudius, particularly the mother character on The Sopranos. I actually haven't watched much of The Sopranos, but apparently the influence of the show has affected a number of modern TV shows or modern soap operas. We'll get to this as we go along maybe. There are a few distortions or fictionalizations, but it is mostly just based on real history. Real history can be the stuff of juicy soap operas. And this is a good case in point. Now, I should mention here maybe that some of the ancient historians, I think particularly the stuff around Nero or Caligula, the charge is often made that perhaps the ancient historians were exaggerating or inventing scandals for the sake of political slander. So the Senate wanted its revenge on an emperor who had tried to usurp some of the authority of the Senate, and so they invented all sorts of gossip about that dead emperor, which got recorded as history, etc. And again, somebody who's more of an expert than I am could give a more detailed explanation of this. So with these more outlandish details about the imperial family, a serious historian maybe would take them with a grain of salt. But this isn't a serious historian, this is historical fiction based on the ancient sources, and a lot of this really juicy gossip and slander is right in there in the ancient sources. So it was a stroke of genius for somebody to say, okay, this would be a perfect soap opera. And I guess credit really has to go to Robert Graves, who wrote the original books. But if you've read the original books, you know that there was a lot of adapting from the story in the original books to the miniseries. So the people who wrote this up for television drama should get a lot of credit for how they adapted this story. All right. Oh, sorry. One more general thought before I get into the story. It was a BBC production in the 1970s, and so the budget was nowhere near what it would be like for HBO Prestige TV nowadays or something like that. You can see that the sets look very flimsy a lot of the times. It looks like they're in a room with just kind of these cardboard sets, and the makeup and the costumes looks like it's a little bit cheap and all that kind of stuff. But to my mind, it just goes to show that you can do a very good historical drama and not spend a lot of money on it. As somebody who is a history buff and would love to see more historical dramas get produced, I take comfort in the fact that I Claudius was able to do it so cheaply. Because, nowadays you think, oh, wouldn't it be great if they would film this historical drama based on the last days of the Roman Republic or something like that. And then you think, well, but they're not going to do that because only a few people would watch it. And the budget to reproduce ancient Rome and all the CGI and all the sets, they would never have the money to. They would never be able to justify all that money for that huge production. Is something I sometimes think to myself when I'm fantasizing about historical dramas about ancient Rome that I'd like to see produced. But then you just think to yourself, I Claudius did this entirely on closed sets in a soundstage with very cheap looking sets, and it was fantastic. It was a very, very watchable drama. So, it just goes to show it is possible to do these things very cheaply, and to have it be interesting and so watchable. It's just so watchable. Okay, now that I've gotten that out of the way, let me go through and maybe walk through the story here for anybody who's not familiar with the historical drama behind this. And along the way, I'll talk about maybe the different things in I Claudius. So I Claudius starts off with the family of Augustus Caesar. So everyone knows Augustus Caesar, right? The adopted son of Julius Caesar, the first imperial family in Rome. Julius Caesar doesn't count. He got assassinated before he could truly establish himself. But Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, and his family. And Augustus Caesar is played by Brian Blessed. So, yes, there are a whole bunch of famous people in this production, and I'll try to remember to go through and highlight them as they come up. And that's another reason why this is such a great and beloved TV miniseries, is because of all the talent attached to it. Brian Blessed, I don't know what your experience or what your association with Brian Blessed is. I was first introduced to him when I saw Return to Treasure Island on the Disney Channel as a kid, which was one of my favorite TV miniseries. We'll have to talk about Return to Treasure Island another day. But Brian Blessed played Long John Silver on that miniseries. Brian Blessed has a very over-the-top style of acting. He's got a great big booming voice. He's been in loads of stuff in British TV. He was on Blackadder. He's regularly on talk shows or game shows in British TV. He's just kind of a fixture of British TV. He was in the Flash Gordon movie. Once you've seen him once, you can never forget him. He's just got this huge, great booming voice. And he is perfect as this over-the-top Augustus Caesar. Now, as the miniseries starts out, Augustus Caesar is getting old, and there's a lot of thought about who his successor is going to be. His wife, Livia, is scheming to get her son Tiberius named as Augustus's successor. Now, Tiberius is Livia's son by a previous marriage. So he's not actually Augustus' son. He's Augustus's stepson. Augustus doesn't actually like Tiberius. Augustus has a whole bunch of other people that he would prefer to Tiberius. But one by one, these other people mysteriously die off. Actually, as you watch the miniseries, it's not so mysterious. The miniseries shows you that Livia is poisoning them or otherwise contriving to have them die in mysterious circumstances until pretty much only Tiberius is left. Now, this theory that Livia killed everybody so that her son Tiberius could become the next emperor goes all the way back to the ancient sources. I'm told that historians don't actually take it seriously. I mean, even though these rumors go all the way back to the ancient Romans, historians think it's not serious. Mike Duncan, who did the podcast, The History of Rome, which is an absolutely brilliant podcast in which I have talked about before on this channel. I'll leave a link to it in the description down below, my review of the History of Rome podcast. Mike Duncan refers to this as the Livia kills everybody theory. Excuse me, my voice is getting a little bit hoarse, so I might sip on this hot tea. The Livia kills everybody theory. Mike Duncan mentions that it's not a serious historical theory, but it was a popular rumor at the time. But I Claudius is historical fiction, so historical fiction is free to go with the historical gossip, and so we're going with the Livia kills everybody theory of history. I don't really remember the tone of the novel so much. I think I do, but it's been a long time. But in the miniseries, at least, it's presented as almost a horror story. So there's this happy family, there's Livia scheming, and there's all these people that she just takes out. And there's not really a lot of suspense in the miniseries, or at least you're not really left in a lot of doubt. Livia targets somebody, and you just know they're going to die. And there's a little they do drag the suspense out a little bit, where you're watching a horror movie and you're like, no, don't trust Livia. No, don't take that drink that she's giving you. No, don't trust Livia's doctors. The way you shout at a horror movie, shout advice to the characters at the screen. But if Livia wants to take somebody out, they get taken out. Now, the protagonist of this story is Claudius, who is also the narrator. He's looking back on his life. Now, Claudius is actually not even the main character in the first few episodes. I think the first episode happened all before he was even born. But he is looking back at his family history and setting this all up. But when Claudius comes on the stage, Claudius was the black sheep of the family. And what I mean by the black sheep, the imperial family was all embarrassed by him because he had physical deformities and he had stutters. And so he was not looked upon as a likely successor to anybody at all. They just looked upon him as an embarrassment to kind of keep out of the public eye as much as possible. Now, Claudius, I think both the historical Claudius and the Claudius portrayed in this miniseries is actually a lot smarter than people think he is. He's interested in history, he writes history. None of his histories have survived, but I believe we do have it verified from the ancient sources that he did write histories. But he gets advice in the miniseries to not let on that he's actually intelligent, to kind of play up his stutter and to kind of play up his imbecility and his clumsiness. Because anybody who looks too bright or smart is going to get targeted by Livia. So Claudius does that. And then eventually Augustus passes away and Tiberius becomes emperor. So now it's accomplished. Now everything that Livia has been scheming for has been accomplished. But it turns out Tiberius is a terrible emperor. He is sexually perverted and twisted. He is vindictive. And also, he allows himself to be controlled by, I believe it's the captain of his Praetorian Guard, a man named Sejanus, who is trying to rule through Tiberius. And Sejanus is a dictator waiting in the wings, who has his own little reign of terror he wants to launch on his enemies. Now, Sejanus is played by none other than Patrick Stewart, the guy who plays Jean-Luc Picard and who plays the Professor Xavier in the X-Men. That Patrick Stewart. He was younger when this miniseries was filmed. He was born in 1940, according to Wikipedia. Miniseries came out in 1976, so I guess he must have been 36 at the time this miniseries was filmed. And Star Trek The Next Generation didn't come out until 1989, so this is like a full 13 years before he became Jean-Luc Picard. He, I don't know, Patrick Stewart has one of those faces where he kind of looks the same no matter how old he is, right? I mean, he just never seems to age. So he pretty much looks the same in this miniseries as he does later when he becomes Jean-Luc Picard in 1989. He does have hair, although I assume it's a wig they've got him wearing. I don't know. The character of Sejanus dominates for a couple episodes. I think it's episodes 7 and 8, where the Sejanus takes over the story. So he does get his fair amount of screen time in this miniseries. But then Tiberius recognizes what Sejanus has done, and then organizes sort of a coup against Sejanus. And Sejanus ends up getting killed, and actually the actor who kills him, the character who kills him, is played by John Rhys Davies. I hope I'm saying that name right. The guy who was Gimli in Lord of the Rings and Sullust in the Indiana Jones movies. He plays the soldier who kills Patrick Stewart's character in I Claudius. So there you go, another actor. Then, after Tiberius, comes Caligula. Now, Caligula is played by John Hurt, who is famous for a lot of stuff. I think most of the stuff I associate him with is when he's playing an old man type character. So, for example, he played Dumbledore in the Harry Potter series. I think after the first Dumbledore died, he became the second Dumbledore. And so it's interesting, you associate him as an old man type figure. But he's playing a very youthful Caligula. Caligula starts out in the miniseries as a very young character, and I think becomes emperor at a very young age and goes mad at a very young age. Now, I looked this up on Wikipedia as well. John Hurt was also 36 when this miniseries was filmed. So he wasn't young. I think they've got some makeup on his face to try and make him look a little bit more boyish than maybe he actually was at 36. But he's meant to be playing a young, boyish character. Now, if you know anything about Roman history, you know that Caligula is famous for being insane and for doing all this insane stuff. Again, maybe some of this was invented or exaggerated by historians with axes to grind, political axes to grind, but seems to be in the history. But the end of, I believe it's the end of episode 8, there's a rather gruesome scene. I guess trigger warning here if you don't want to hear this. But he's having an incestuous relationship with his sister Drusillus. And Caligula gets it into his head because Claudius has been talking about Greek mythology. Claudius was talking about how Zeus ate the fetus of one of his offspring, Athena, and then Athena sprang from his head. Caligula thinks he's going to imitate Zeus. Caligula also believes he's a god, so he's got his sister Drusilla impregnated. He ties her up. She's thinking they're going to do some kinky sex stuff, so she's getting all into it. And then he cuts open her belly and eats the fetus. Now, according to Wikipedia, there was quite some debate at the BBC about how exactly this was to be filmed and broadcast. According to Wikipedia, there were also a few different versions that were filmed that the BBC decided they were not going to broadcast. The current version just kind of cuts out and you hear the screaming. And then at the very end you see Caligula emerging with the bloody mouth. So, yeah, that's obviously the version where everything gruesome just gets implied off screen. But still, it's a gruesome scene to get implied. Now, here I guess is one of those cases where the miniseries seems to differ from history because I don't remember how this was portrayed in the novel. And again, it was a while since I read the novel. But I went and double-checked this with the history of Caligula online, again, looking at Wikipedia and stuff like that. And it appears that this scene was invented for the miniseries. Caligula never butchered his sister and ate her fetus. Not even in the ancient sources. That was, I don't know whose idea that was. I guess somebody decided we really need to give them a shocking moment at this point in the miniseries. I was Googling this before doing this review. Somebody at Reddit was saying, why did they invent this? There was so much shocking stuff already that Caligula did in the ancient sources. Why bring on this really gruesome thing that wasn't even in the histories? Well, they did it. I guess what can you say, but it makes for memorable television. We can debate whether or not this was in good taste or whether this was a good move, but there we go. Anyways, Caligula then gets assassinated, and they're looking for a new emperor to proclaim. And they find Claudius hiding behind the curtains. And that's the story of how Claudius, who was the most unlikeliest person ever to become emperor, it was deformed, he stuttered, he wasn't charismatic at all, but through the circumstances of history, the guard proclaims him emperor. And that's where the novel I Claudius ends. And then Claudius the God is the next novel, and again the miniseries just continues the story straight. Now, based on the story of I Claudius, we would think that once Claudius becomes emperor, he will become a very wise and good emperor because he's got all these crazy people before him, but he himself is an intellectual and he's very capable and he's a good person, etc. But again, if you know your Roman history, you know that the reign of Claudius is mixed, and his primary tragic flaw seems to be that he allowed his wives to take advantage of him and promote their favorites, and just seemed to have been very weak when it came to his wives. Sorry, I'm running out of time because the camera I'm using shuts off after 30 minutes. And I generally just accept that as my time limit here. So I'm not going to have a ton of time to talk about the remaining part of the miniseries. Just very briefly, it's interesting comparing Claudius the God, the novel, with the version in the TV miniseries. Because the version in the TV miniseries really highlights the scandals. There's sexual scandals involving Claudius's wife Messalina, who was unfaithful to him. At one point, she had a competition with a famous prostitute to see who could sleep with the most men in a single day. This is mentioned very briefly in the novel Claudius the God, but it's mentioned just as an aside. Whereas the novel Claudius the God focuses on a lot more boring stuff, like Claudius's senatorial reforms, Claudius's engineering projects, Claudius's religious thoughts. But, credit where credit is due, the writers of the miniseries knew how to draw the audience in. So they take these sexual scandals, which make up a very small portion of the novel Claudius the God, and they make that into the main event. If you're doing a soap opera TV miniseries, I guess that is what you want to focus on. So it is different seeing those differences. Sorry, it is interesting seeing those differences between the novel and the miniseries. Obviously, the miniseries is less intelligent than the novel, but it's supposed to be engaging TV, and they succeed. It is really watchable. Okay, I'm out of time. I'm going to have to finish here. But if you haven't seen the miniseries, by all means check it out. Trust me, you will find it watchable.